Okay, we are going to get started so we can get on time. If you are just coming in, please try to find a seat quickly so we can get rolling. My name is Sierra Downs, and I have the privilege of introducing Kevin Gold this morning for your session speaker. I had to write this down and read it because I will cry if I try to say it on my own. So, Kevin is a young man marked by integrity, kindness, endless curiosity, and true humility. It is exceedingly rare to find individuals whose hearts are just as big as their minds, but that is exactly who Kevin is. So it came as no surprise when he chose to study empathy this year. I'm so excited for you all to get to learn more about this virtue from Kevin this morning. After working closely with him on this project over the last year, I think differently about myself, about the world, and about my God, and I'm grateful. I'm confident that Kevin will continue to change the world around him for good. Please welcome Kevin Gold.
Thank you, Ms. Downs. What do you love? This question was posed to us seniors days before we were put in the back of a truck and dropped off in the wilderness for 7 to 9 hours to ponder our answer to that question. I already knew my answer, so I had different questions running through my head. How do you love? How do you love sinners? How do you love sufferers? How can I know that God loves me? And above all, what does empathy have to do with all of that? After a year of deep research, I believe that I've found the answer. I'm deeply passionate about all of this, but unfortunately, all these answers and ideas won't fit into the 20 minutes I have. I've tried to sift through everything and leave you with the important things, but even then, it's dense. Emotions and definitions and the reality of human experience. So I would ask that you bear with me, buckle up, and explore empathy with me in these next 20 minutes. First, imagine a close friend or mentor of yours. Imagine that you're sitting with them in a familiar place, about to tell them something deeply personal. Think of that thing. Close your eyes and imagine it. Maybe it's a buried pain, a memory you avoid, or a part of your past that you just don't like talking about because people wouldn't understand. You can open your eyes now. In my life, I've had moments exactly like this. Moments where I knew I needed to be vulnerable, but was too scared or uncomfortable to. I remember one afternoon I was driving with a friend to go get coffee. There was a lot on my mind, things I knew I should share but didn't want to. 2 hours later, my friend and I were still talking, in the car. We never went inside to go get coffee. I often look back to that time as a turning point in my life, my faith, and my friendship. None of it was easy, but I didn't do it alone. My friend helped me, and yes, they were confused and saddened, but in that moment, we suffered together, and good fruit came of it. Looking back, I can confidently say that then, my friend practiced empathy. But a year ago, I would not have been as sure. I've long cared about empathy and its meaning and relevance in my life, but for a while, it wasn't as clear. So when I began thinking about my capstone, I decided to use this year-long research project to answer my burning question. What is empathy? But first, I had to compare it to what it was not. When you ask Merriam-Webster for the 3 synonyms of empathy, you'll get these results. First, sympathy, and then pity and compassion. When I started my research, these 3 words were the bane of my existence. What set them apart from empathy? Were they just interchangeable? Should I study compassion instead? Empathy was never mentioned in the Bible, but compassion was. Empathy started as a translation for a German psychological term in 1908, while the word pity had been around for 800 years, sympathy 600. Empathy was the ugly duckling of the family. So, in my first few months, I sought out to define these 3 words, not just through a quick Google search, but by exploring how they functioned, how humans regarded them, and how they influenced our behavior, interactions, and society. This was no easy task. I was stepping into spaces where professionals and psychologists had already set clear definitions and saying that I could redefine all of these things because I was relying on the truth of the Bible. I've done my best to nuance these definitions well and to capture the ideas that I want to convey and which I care deeply about. So let's start with compassion, beginning with the best source of truth, the Bible. God calls Christians to be kind to one another and to put on compassionate hearts. In the Gospels, Christ had compassion for others and God. and God is often described as merciful, tender-hearted, and compassionate. Compassion in the Bible frequently accompanies descriptions of God's kind understanding and his merciful action towards people. When we apply this to our lives, we'll find that compassion is a virtuous response, grounded in understanding and action that seeks to address a person's suffering and needs. Understanding and action. Hold on to these two words in your mind, because I'm going to come back to them. For now, let's move on to sympathy. I have a story to tell for this one. This is Howie and Laurel Borowick. They were both diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Howie called these the his and hers chairs. Here he sits beside Laurel, his wife of 34 years, about to receive a weekly chemotherapy treatment. In December, almost a year after Howie's diagnosis, he passed away. He planned his own funeral, wrote his own eulogy, and asked that he be buried in his favorite jersey and his hat. Laurel kept fighting until a year later, she died. In her bed, as she'd wanted. If you feel moved or emotional because of this story, you're in the majority. Sharing personal or bittersweet stories creates bonds between people, and leading to higher levels of oxytocin in the brain and resulting in emotional sensitivity and connection. This kind of reaction is sympathy. Sympathy, defined, is a reflexive emotional response. Similar to how your knee jerks when a doctor hits it with a rubber hammer, as long as all of your nerves and tendons are working properly. In a similar way, if your brain isn't desensitized emotionally, you will respond sympathetically to different stimuli. Photos, events, news broadcasts, movies, and stories all around you. Sympathy is so natural that we have a name for the kind of people that cannot sympathize with others. Psychopaths. However, we must remember that sympathy is an instinct and not a virtue. Take a traditional virtue, like courage or kindness. Both are choices and not instincts. They go against our natural fight or flight and survival of the fittest responses. Sympathy is missing something. It can't be a virtue on its own, because even babies naturally experience it, sharing emotion before they've even begin to comprehend the idea of virtue. Research shows that when babies hear other babies crying, they react to the pain as if they were experiencing it themselves. When I told you about Howie and Laurel, you likely felt real sadness, even though their deaths occurred over a decade ago and had no real effect on you or your current situation. You felt pain in a small way, reflecting and absorbing their suffering like a mirror or a sponge. Many would call this co-suffering. Howie and Laurel's story moved you. You didn't choose to be moved, and unless you actively resisted sympathy in that moment, you had no control over your emotions. In that instant, we can find that sympathy is the kind of co-suffering we do not control. Take a look at this. Dog shelter and rescue commercials, like the one here, make money off of your sympathy. They know they can win your donations through it. That right there is crowd control. Understanding human nature and capitalizing on it. It's not always a bad thing, but we have to recognize that in these moments, our emotions are taken control of in powerful ways. Take a look at this news article, for example. The Oklahoma City bombing. A mother's baby girl killed in an act of violence. Tiananmen Square. A lone hero defying the advancement of tanks. The Syrian refugee crisis. Children wrecked by the consequences of war. When our attention is focused from the masses to the individual, we become more invested. This tool has been used poorly before. Think of the Vietnam War, the first majorly televised war in human history. When Americans back at home saw the atrocities of war that they'd never seen or heard of before, protests broke out in ways they never had before in American history. Soldiers expecting a warm welcome upon return were spit on instead. Sympathy grabs attention. It gains investment. And it even makes us more vulnerable to tolerance. When we're sympathetic towards a thing, we grow emotionally attached to it. And if we're not careful, we might end up tolerating and excusing things we know to be wrong simply because we feel for their cause. Sympathy, then, is the starting place for many other ideas I'll be discussing today. Tolerance, compassion, empathy, and most interestingly, pity as well. Pity begins when we view sufferers as inferior to us, when we believe that people who are hurting need our help and that they can't go on without us, we've stepped into the dangerous world of pity. Pity begins with sympathy, but creates distance between the sufferer and the friend instead of bringing them together. Pity rarely prompts real kindness. It replaces the warmth of compassion with quiet condescension. This is why you hear phrases like, "I don't want your pity," because pity is rarely received well, and "it's a pity" is rarely paired with acts of kindness. Both self-pity and pity come from a place of self-centeredness. Either we're the best, so we could never fall that far, or we're the worst, so broken that no one can understand what we've gone through. That brings us to empathy, something different than the other three. Its meaning, however, is rooted in one of these. Where does it fit in? Sympathy functions as the reflexive emotional response. Pity is often received as the distant belittling of a sufferer. And then there's compassion. Earlier, I introduced two key components of compassion: understanding and action. It is in these that empathy lies. Compassion is a virtue. It's a form of kindness, which is a fruit of the Spirit, something we as Christians are called to grow in daily. But what makes compassion so unique is that it is meant to specifically address sinners and sufferers, those who are struggling, the very people Jesus came into the world for, the very people you and I are. At the start of my speech, I asked you to think of a moment you don't like talking about because other people wouldn't understand. Chances are that moment was either one of great sin or great suffering. A heart-wrenching loss, a shameful mistake, a repeated abuse, or an isolated battle. Our world is broken. Our lives are marked by hurt and loss, but we find hope in Emmanuel, God with us. With us in our suffering. With us in a world of sin, a man who ate dinner with prostitutes and greedy tax collectors, a man who suffered with you and I in our pain in ways no one else ever has. When Jesus was crucified, God made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. In the greatest act of salvation, Christ suffered for his people, enduring on the cross everything we had endured in our lives, and taking the wrath of God as our sacrificial lamb. If this is not co-suffering, then I ask you, what is? Through both his omniscience and his life and his suffering on earth, Jesus Christ knows and understands our sin and suffering more intimately than anyone else. And this is why I would make the claim that Jesus, the man of sorrows, is our perfect role model and example of empathy. We've seen that compassion responds to suffering through understanding and action. Thus, the first step of compassion before any action can be taken is understanding. We must seek to understand. And how do we do that? Empathy. Empathy, defined, is the ability to seek to understand and co-suffer with another. Empathy is a skill we can develop. It breathes life into our love. And practiced rightly, it can transform every one of our lives. So let's start with the concept of co-suffering. I already explored why it mattered in Christ's ministry. But why does it matter for us? Some define empathy solely as co-suffering, and I believe this is untrue. This is what gets us into the headspace of saying things like, no one could fully understand us. When we get into that headspace, we isolate ourselves by thinking that we are unreachable to others' love, because no one has experienced what we have. While it is true that no one except Christ can fully understand us, we must remember that as people living in a broken world, our stories of sin and suffering all have some overlap. And when we sit for a moment in those spaces, we can touch each other's lives more intimately. Co-suffering acts as a doorway into each other's experiences, whereby recalling the pains and struggles of our life, we are better enabled to step into the pains and sufferings of another's. It's literally the idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But we must be careful not to project our own experiences onto others. When friends come to us with stories or struggles, and we flip it around and make it about ourselves, or assume that they should handle it the same way, we lose sight of the person altogether. Empathy creates opportunities to step into another's hurt, forming a space where we can both understand and grow together. It is not a space to bemoan life's difficulties and wallow in grievances. Empathy, unlike sympathy, is the kind of co-suffering we can control. This is what makes it a virtue. We have to choose it. And once we choose it, we can step into the spaces it creates for us in order to know and love like Christ. This brings us to understanding, the most life-changing aspect of empathy, in my opinion. Co-suffering opens the doorway for deeper understanding and knowing of each other, and as Mrs. Langer, a parent here at Front Range, said, it is a fairly universal truth that we all want to be known as human beings. Regardless of personality types and personal difficulties, we desire to be known and loved, and if we reverse the roles, at our best moments, we desire to know and love others. To love a person well, you must know them first, and to know them, you must understand them. Understanding is the rudder that steers our great big ships of love. Without it, we're just drifting through the night, unable to connect or trade goods, drifting through the currents of convenience. Think of the 5 love languages, a universally accepted frame for how we love and feel loved. When we ask about another's love language, we're seeking to understand them so that we may love them better. This is the baby steps of empathy. But empathy becomes more difficult when we stretch it past our comfort zone. When we seek to understand someone who hates us, or refuses to admit wrongdoing, or comes from a demographic we may have a prejudice against, our empathy grows even more powerful, bridging gaps that once seemed impossible to cross. This is what makes empathy a virtue. The church is made up of enemies turned friends, prostitutes turned mothers, and murderers turned priests. And when we, as Christians already in the church, extend empathy to those outside of it to show them Christ's love, God can work in extraordinary ways. We should not excuse our lack of empathy by claiming that some are born empaths while others are not. Empathy is not baked into our DNA. It can be achieved in every one of us. And even those raised in families that encourage empathy have blind spots and prejudices where they can grow. We can all grow. As we pursue empathy, however, we must practice caution. All virtues have boundaries. We must keep in mind that sometimes we're not in a place to co-suffer. If we're in a season of personal struggle, it may not be wise to step into another's suffering. Empathy begins with self-awareness. Empathy also doesn't cancel out the need for confrontation or action. As I mentioned earlier, empathy makes up the understanding piece of action. The other half, the understanding piece of compassion. The other half, action, is just as necessary. When we truly seek to understand someone, we're better equipped to speak into their life and to take meaningful action. This action can take 2 forms. The first, presence. Sometimes we're unable to do anything. And so instead, we are called to step into their lives, to be available, causing change through our presence. In the other scenarios, though, we're called to take effective action. This is the second form. If we begin to understand how a friend has been struggling with a sin, or is scared to confront an abuser, or unable to recover from a depressive episode, we are in a better place to take action in their lives and help them in the fight. And just because we understand another's sin and suffering does not mean we should tolerate it. If we empathize with someone whose lifestyle goes against what we stand for, we are then better equipped to step into their life and not give up on our beliefs and standards. In this space, we can speak God's truth and love more profoundly without compromising what we know to be right. Empathy, ultimately, is a learned way of being. One that rarely comes easy. Many of us, after a few failed attempts, close off to others. We don't tell our stories anymore. We don't confess our struggles. This is not how we were made to live. We were made to thrive in relationship, to know and be known. And so I ask you now, do you seek to know others? Do you pursue understanding? Or do you hold quiet grudges against certain people, certain sins? Do you look down on people whose stories are different from your own? I certainly do. And realizing that was not easy. But that reminded me that there will always be room to grow. This year, I've researched and practiced empathy in numerous ways. I spoke to a professor from Baylor University who fought cancer for many years and now works to improve education systems. He spoke to me about how empathy has power in resolution, learning, change, and self-improvement. I also practiced empathy with preschoolers and high schoolers. And I interviewed a parent on how empathy functions within the home and what role it plays within parenting. I studied how empathy can go wrong and its role in politics, the church, and education. But above all, I learned that empathy is good. And it is important for my life. And that is why, even after my capstone, I hope to continue to grow in it. I encourage you to do the same. Ask questions. Learn more about what empathy is and what it can do in your life. And at the end of the day, if you walk out disagreeing with any of the definitions I've made, I would ask you instead to dwell on the ideas I put before you. Compassion, action, understanding, and love. love for sinners and sufferers, and love that reflects the love of Christ. I'll end with this. Be the kind of person who is brave enough to seek to understand, brave enough to step into another's suffering. And above all, be the kind of person who is brave enough to truly know and be known. Thank you.